Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this conference. It's always great to have, to see so many friendly faces and in such an incredible city like Rome. I'm going to jump right in because we're already running a little bit late. This plenary session is called Forests and Livelihoods in a New Era of International Commitments, the Promise and Challenge of Implementation. So there are all kinds of commitments out there, all kinds of pledges. There's zero deforestation pledges, zero deforestation in value chains, climate pledges and funding to support mitigation and/or adaptation. There are biodiversity pledges under the CBD. Generally speaking, these pledges are somewhat similar. They're all aimed at bringing about some specific change to business as usual, and above all, to support biophysical goals. The most interesting, however, are the new pledges to Indigenous peoples and local communities to support efforts to fight climate change. This includes $1.7 billion from the COP last year, as well as new funds that are coming in today. This pledge also has biophysical goals, but it has something new and different. From Darren Walker at the Ford Foundation, this historic $1.7 billion pledge is a challenge to all funders to do far more to support and partner with Indigenous peoples and local communities who hold a key solution to climate change and have them lead the way. These pledges, in theory, are aimed at getting funding to the ground, directly into the hands of Indigenous peoples and local communities. This is a significant change, intended to address, among other things, the very small portion of climate finance that has gone to Indigenous peoples and local communities, as well as the risks that some of these other pledges pose. But this strategy has its own risks. As Darren Walker said in a webinar last week, it's historic, but only if implemented consistent with its meaning. There's a lot to discuss here. First of all, this is a lot of pledges, and each of them implies a lot of land area. In fact, there's nowhere near enough land to actually meet all of the pledges. There's a new land gap report that's going to be released at the COP this year with numbers. Second, anything having to do with land-based pledges has a potential impact on land-based peoples. This can be an opportunity or a risk for these communities, as well as for subgroups within these communities, such as women. Perhaps the opportunity is greater with the direct pledge to Indigenous peoples and local communities, but the challenges are also significant. We have a group of panelists here today who can speak to all of these questions, and I'm going to introduce each of them in a moment, but first, here's how we'll organize the plenary today. First, each panelist will have 3 to 5 minutes for an opening statement about what they think is most important and most timely about the topic of the panel. We have 5 speakers, plus Melania will be speaking in Spanish, so with time for translation, we expect that to take about 30 minutes. Then we'll take another 30 minutes to have a conversation among the panelists. We'll open up for about 15 minutes of questions from the audience, and then we'll close with one last round of closing statements from the panelists. So, to the introductions, and I'll introduce them in the order that they will present. Bryson Ogden. Bryson is the Director of Rights, Livelihoods, and the Private Sector Engagement Program of the Rights and Resources Initiative. He has 12 years of experience leading and supporting work in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America to advance rights-based economic development. He coordinates the Interlochen Group network of companies, investors, rights holders, and civil society to scale up private sector support for community land tenure. Prior to joining RRI, he worked as a portfolio manager and equity analyst covering the energy sector. Second, we'll hear from Melania Canales Poma. Melania is the leader of the Quechua people in the Ayacucho region of Peru. She's the outgoing president of the National Organization of Andean and Amazonian Women of Peru, ONAMIAP, and she's the coordinator of the southeastern region of the Continental Link of Indigenous Women of the Americas, ECMIA Sur, and part of the ECMIA Collegiate Council. She's been involved in the design of land titling projects funded by the Inter-American Development Bank, advocating for a gender equity perspective. She's held different positions in the rural community of Lucanas, including serving as the elected mayor of the Lucanas district. Then we'll hear from Georgina Barker. George is the Smallholder Policy and Program Advisor for the International Forests Unit of the United Kingdom's Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Office. In this role, she's the policy lead for Forest, Agriculture, Commodity, and Trade, the FACT Dialogue, Smallholder Support Action Group. She's advisor for the UK's Partnership for Forest portfolio in West Africa and Southeast Asia, and co-designer of a new €500 million investment in forest and sustainable use program. We'll then go to Kevin Currey. Kevin is the Climate and Land Use Initiative, CLUA, Global Initiative Lead, as well as Program Officer with the Ford Foundation's Natural Resources and Climate Change team. His work focuses on helping Indigenous peoples and local communities to secure their land and resource rights, and on realizing the potential of tropical forests and land use to mitigate climate change and benefit low-income rural communities. And finally, we will hear from Truly Santika. Truly is a senior fellow in biostatistics for food and agriculture in the Natural Resources Institute at the University of Greenwich in the UK. Her work uses geospatial analysis and statistical modeling to understand the relationships between environmental change, ecosystem functioning, livelihoods and agriculture, and human well-being to inform policy and decision-making processes towards sustainability. She's led various interdisciplinary projects on the impact of oil palm and sustainability certification on livelihoods and poverty, on community forestry and land use planning, climate change adaptation, species and biodiversity conservation, and theoretical spatial analysis and macroecology. So, without further ado, I will hand over to Bryson as our first speaker. So each person, 3 to 5 minutes for a quick opening statement. Thank you.
Okay, it's good. Good morning. And thank you, Anne. And thanks to all of you for the opportunity to participate in this conference, to share some thoughts with you, and of course to be part of this distinguished panel. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Rights and Resources Initiative, RRI is a global coalition of over 200 organizations across the tropical forested world, indigenous, community, and Afro-descendant networks, local organizations, NGOs, and academic institutions. And the purpose of the coalition is to collectively advance legislative, policy, and market reforms to secure collective tenure rights and community women's rights as well to forests and territories. So collective action to secure collective tenure rights, and in doing so, conserving forests and supporting rural livelihoods. Like Anne mentioned, I lead RRI's work on private sector engagement and local livelihoods, but over the last year, I've worn a different hat. And I've helped coordinate our work to advance new re-granting mechanisms to channel global financial support directly to rights holders on the ground to manage and conserve forests and other landscapes. So 2 reasons that I think this topic is really timely, and conference as well. The first is that if we're to mitigate climate change and conserve remaining biodiversity by 2030, then indigenous peoples, local communities, Afro-descendant peoples, and women have to be part of the solution, not as beneficiaries, but as partners. The COP26 pledge simultaneously positions communities as part of the solution, but along with the potential for really meaningful levels of funding. And to my knowledge, this is the first time that these 2 pieces have come together. And so in that sense, it's unprecedented. The second reason, and more narrowly focused on the people in this room, is that this is the first time, to my knowledge, that we see the potential for substantial direct funding to support community management and governance of forests and rural landscapes. The type of work that people in this room, you folks, have been advocating and promoting for years. So there's a big opportunity with the implementation of the pledge, related commitments, some of the new financing mechanisms, which I think we'll get into later, to really mainstream the link between forests and livelihoods, to move beyond this group of the converted to other key stakeholder groups, like governments, the private sector, and the conservation sector, all of whom must be influenced. So I'm looking forward to getting into the details shortly, but that's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryson. Now we'll go over to Melania, please.
Alimpuncho kachun la plaichita liu kaipi tarikos kunata. Buenos días a todos y todas. Bueno, he saludado en mi idioma original. Soy del pueblo quechua.
Good morning to everybody. I was just speaking my original language and I come from Quechua.
Soy parte integrante de la Federación Regional de Mujeres Indígenas de Ayacucho, que es integrante de la Organización Nacional de Mujeres Indígenas del Perú, Andinas y Amazónicas, y parte integrante del Enlace Continental de Mujeres Indígenas de las Américas, ECMIA.
I am part and I'm also the president of the National Organization of Andean and Amazonian Women of Peru.
Pues vengo de las montañas donde los glaciales se derriten, donde el agua se hace escasa.
I come from those mountains where glaciers are melting and water is becoming rare.
Es importante proteger el territorio integral, o sea, las montañas, los bosques y los océanos.
It's very important to protect our territory, our land in its integrity, meaning mountains, forests, and oceans.
Porque todo es una articulación o relación y todos se necesitan. Por lo tanto, los compromisos financieros deben ser para proteger esa integralidad.
Because everything is connected, we need everything. So financial commitments must be done in a way to protect this integrity.
Y no solo pensar en los bosques, porque los pueblos indígenas están también en la costa, en los Andes y Amazonía.
We don't have to think only about forests actually, because we as indigenous people live also in Amazonian or on the part where there are oceans, so beaches.
Además, pensemos en la protección de las vidas, que no solo son las personas, sino también la flora y la fauna que están en los territorios.
We also have to think about protecting lives, not only lives of people, but also lives of the animals and the plants that are part of the land.
Que sin esas otras vidas no es posible la vida de las personas.
Without these lives, the lives of people are not possible.
Y la vida no se negocia. La vida no tiene precio alguno.
And we cannot negotiate with life. Life has no price at all.
Por ello es importante proteger las vidas para el buen vivir, sea para una vida digna de las futuras generaciones.
That's why it's important to protect life also for the life of future generations.
Por eso a todos ustedes les digo, pensemos en esas futuras generaciones, no solo pensemos en el ahora, en nosotros o en nosotras. Y asimismo los financiamientos tienen que ayudar a solucionar la crisis climática para una vida digna.
So what I'm going to say to you is that we have to think well about next generation. We don't have to think only about ourselves. And financial aids must be done in a way to help for the climate crisis.
Bien, muchas gracias.
Y thank you very much.
Gracias, Melania. Next, we'll hear from George.
Thank you. Yeah, and thanks, Anne, for the introduction. So I think it's for me, it's really timely from a UK perspective, this conference. It's important as we move into COP27 and hand over that presidency to Egypt. Is it ringing? No? Okay, sorry. Yeah, so as we hand over the presidency to Egypt, it's important that we reflect on what was achieved at COP26 and what that means going forward. And I think there was a real turning point at COP26 with respect to nature being placed at the centre of some of those COP discussions, both across forests, but also agriculture, food systems and biodiversity, which obviously have significant overlap with the forest agenda. Sorry.
Oh, into the microphone.
Okay. Can you hear better now? Sorry. So I won't repeat what Anne has covered about the pledges specifically, but with regards to that forward look and key next steps, some of that includes progress reports being published at COP27 to update and to track where we are a year on. And at the pre-COP in the DRC last week, some of that initial progress reporting has already happened, with $300 million US dollars being reported to be spent in that region and to the 1.5 billion Congo Forest Pledge. More broadly, the Forest Climate Leadership Partnership was launched at the UN General Assembly in September, and that will be formally launched at COP, but that aims to build cooperation and collaboration around these pledges moving forward, and also aims to establish an annual meeting at the COPs right up until 2030 to have that reporting and that feedback mechanism built in. But obviously the conference isn't just about the finance and the commitments, but also ways to implement these now. And there are a number of key policy initiatives alongside the finance that really underpin the delivery of some of that. So for example, on the IPLC Forest Tenure Pledge, there is the donor support statement that sees donors committing to empower and enable and promote the inclusion of IPLC groups in key decision-making processes. And then specifically to the area that I work on, which is crucial for this when we talk about what's important on this agenda, is smallholders, and smallholders specifically in forest risk commodities. I think it's important to note that smallholders are often local communities in these landscapes, and they often can be indigenous peoples as well. And there are specific policy mechanisms that I'm working on that impact this demographic. For example, from a domestic perspective, there are due diligence legislation processes underway in a number of consumer countries, including the UK, that look to better regulate and eliminate the import of commodities linked to deforestation and illegal deforestation into those markets. Additionally, it's already been mentioned, but we have the Forest, Agriculture, Commodity and Trade Dialogue, or the FACT Dialogue, and that looks to bring together producer and consumer countries to collaborate on key challenges in the sector. There are a number of focus areas established under this, looking at trade and markets, transparency and traceability, research, development and innovation, and also smallholder support. And within the Smallholder Support Action Group, a key challenge that we are looking at overcoming is this piece around scaling up access to finance for smallholders. And some of that will be looking at how a lot of these big commitments actually do reach the hands of farmers at the local level. But despite how big a lot of the pledges are, we also know that it's not enough to really address the scale of the challenge. And so a major objective for us as donors is to look at how to use public funding in these commitments to really unlock and leverage private finance as well. In the smallholder perspective, both traders and big companies, as well as local and national banks and finance institutions, are key sources of finance for smallholders. So some of this includes looking at programming to support public-private partnerships that ensure that Smallholder inclusion is really embedded into that process and that work to support their capacity building, to meet these new regulations that are coming on in a lot of consumer countries, and to ensure that they're not excluded from these markets as that shift happens. And then some of this includes looking at the finance more directly, how we use public finance to de-risk investments into agri-SMEs, both for lenders, but also for the borrowers as well. And significantly, how you can green that finance, how you use that to incentivize more sustainable practices, to strengthen livelihoods that have better environmental outcomes, and ultimately how you reward farmers and pay them the true cost of production that is often the case in a lot of these commodities. And just I'm very excited to be here and hear cross-pollination from smallholders and IPLC groups, so thank you.
Thank you, Georgina. Over to Kevin.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me here. I'm going to tell you a bit about the 1.7 billion pledge for tenure rights and forest guardianship that was announced at COP26. I'll tell you how it came together, what the donors who committed to it are doing to implement it, and why it's not as important as it seems. So those are the 3 points I'd like to make. Okay, number one, why did it come together? Well, you've already heard a bit from Anne in the introduction that the research in the past 10 years, and many of you have contributed to this, so thank you, has really come to show that when Indigenous peoples and local communities have their rights respected and when they're properly supported, they can make a globally significant contribution to stopping deforestation, protecting biodiversity, improving public health. So the rationale for supporting their rights is stronger than ever, and the importance of that for the goal of mitigating climate change is painfully obvious now. At the same time, while we've seen this huge surge in the evidence base, we haven't seen any change in funding going to Indigenous peoples and local communities. In fact, that level has been flat for the last 20 years. And there was a report that came out before COP called Falling Short by Rainforest Foundation Norway, which looked at how much money is going to support tenure rights and forest guardianship of Indigenous peoples and local communities living in tropical forests. And it's less than $300 million a year. And that number is so small, I don't even need to give you a comparator to understand how woefully inadequate that is for a constituency which protects literally half the surface of the planet. So that was the gap that we tried to address by putting together this pledge. The $1.7 billion commitment was made by 22 funders. That's 5 governments, the UK, US, Norway, Germany, and the Netherlands. And then 17 foundations and other funders who came together to announce this commitment. The money that's dispersed under the pledge will focus on 2 areas. So first is everything to do with the recognition and security of rights over lands and resources for Indigenous peoples and local communities. And the second is the ambition to support, as directly as possible, the strengthening of Indigenous and local community governance systems, management systems, and sustainable livelihoods, and also to support and empower Indigenous and local community organizations and networks to allow them to continue doing the work that they've been doing so effectively with so little support. So how are we implementing the pledge? Well, first we had to come up with an acronym because the pledge doesn't have one, so we've created something called the FTFG, the Forest Tenure Funders Group, which is comprised of representatives of all of the donors who have committed to the pledge. We meet on a regular basis, and we've come up with a work plan that we've agreed together. And that work plan has 5 goals. So first of all, to create a monitoring and accountability system that makes sure we actually deliver on the commitment that we've made. We will be producing annual reports that we'll release around the COP, which shows how far we've gone in actually getting the money out the door in support of the pledge goals. I can say the Ford Foundation on our side, we've committed $100 million. We've just put out a report on our website. The first year and a half, we have dispersed $68 million against the pledge, so we're happy that we're on track. But we also found that we're having trouble getting money out to Indigenous peoples and local communities as directly as we would like to, and that only 17% of that funding has gone directly to Indigenous and community organizations. So by tracking these kinds of metrics, we're able to see where there are gaps in the funding. Second thing we've done is come up with a statement of principles of how, as funders, we want to engage with Indigenous peoples and local communities going forward in a way that seeks to kind of reset the dialogue and approach it from a place of partnership rather from the pace of power imbalance that has been so prominent in the previous discussions and negotiations between donors and Indigenous peoples. The third is to support analytical work, which helps us understand where donors can put money. How do we move money more effectively to Indigenous peoples and local communities? What mechanisms, organizations, institutions are doing that well? How do we support that, and how do we capture lessons from those and spread them? The fourth thing is a consultation process with Indigenous peoples to understand their aspirations for the pledge. What, if it's implemented successfully, what would that really mean for them? And how would they like to restructure the relationship between donors and Indigenous peoples to make it more equitable and effective? And the fifth thing is having dialogues directly with Indigenous and local community organizations to hear from them their concerns about what funders are supporting and not supporting, and try to find new ways of working more effectively together. So that's what we're doing. The last thing I'll say quickly is that we know this is not enough. It's a small step forward in a positive direction. Bryson can correct me later, but I believe research from RI has shown that it's at least $1 billion a year over the next 10 years that's going to be needed for this agenda. So the 1.7 billion that's been pledged over 5 years is a drop in the bucket compared to what's needed. But we do hope that by making this commitment and by publicly holding ourselves accountable to realizing it, this can be the first step towards a journey of properly financing the communities on the ground who are really doing the work of protecting forests and mitigating climate change, and have been doing that without compensation for forever.
Thank you, Kevin. And we go to our final speaker, Truly.
Good morning, everybody. So in terms of timely topic, I'd like to touch on the academic perspective, especially how can research contribute to informing better financial and other commitments to forest, Indigenous people, and local communities. For example, how can research can... Can you move closer to the microphone? Oh, sorry. Thank you. Okay. So yeah, so for example, how can research inform better new understanding of the situation on the ground, and to unpack and unravel the complex social realities and challenges faced by Indigenous and local communities and field agents working on forest and community-related programs, as well as smallholders in agriculture settings. Research can also help probably guide the design of better monitoring and evaluation methods of forest and agriculture sustainability programs for them to be more holistic and inclusive. So not only considering the observed biophysical process, but also proxies of the latent social structure, dynamics, and histories. Through research, I think we could also try to improve understanding of the broader drivers of environmental pressure facing forests and Indigenous and local communities, such as the role of global trade and global consumptions of goods, and try to find better strategies to mitigate this. And additionally, I think it's also timely that research can provide better opportunities for young researchers from developing countries to lead publication in science. I think that's really important, especially in an area where this has been weak so far. For example, in data and methods and landscape monitoring and evaluation of forest, biodiversity, livelihood, and human well-being relationship. Yeah, thank you, Anne.
Thank you. Thank you all for your interesting commentaries so far. I'm sorry that the room isn't a little bit more in a circle where we can see each other better, but I think I will stay here, and hopefully we can all try to I'd really like to get a conversation going among the panelists and not just me ask questions, so hopefully that can happen. I'm going to start with a question first to Bryson, and then anyone else can follow up. So one of the main issues with this plethora of pledges is the risk that they'll do harm to Indigenous peoples and local communities. I'm mostly talking about the ones that aren't directly aimed at Indigenous peoples and local communities, though of course they could also do harm. At best, in some pledges, they're considered beneficiaries, but not full partners, as you said yourself previously. They often don't, So I guess the question is, even though Kevin said maybe it's not so important, is this new pledge, is it meaningful in other ways besides the actual amount of money that there is so far? Is it possibly a game changer? And does it have the potential to be a game changer for some of these other pledges, and if so, what would that take? And maybe you can give us a little of the statistics too behind some of the information.
Okay, I'll be happy to do that. Thank you, Ann. Okay, is the pledge a game changer? Kevin asked me before we got started if we could have a disagreement on the panel, which I didn't want to do. And I find that I'm in agreement with Kevin. I think it's important, but maybe it's not quite as important as it seems. Important for a number of ways, but I think there's a lot more to do in terms of being a game changer. It's key because it represents, I think as I mentioned a moment ago, it represents major international recognition of the critical role of rights holders in managing and governing forests as a solution to the climate and biodiversity crises, and the commitment of substantial funding, I think more is required, but substantial funding to support it. This is important momentum, and of course, as the panel started to elaborate on, now the questions around implementation. How are funds going to be delivered or channeled in an inclusive manner at scale to the point of impact, which I think everyone here has talked about already in some form or fashion. The gap globally in terms of collective land tenure and recognition globally, Indigenous peoples, local communities, Afro-descendant peoples customarily claim around 50% of the world's forests, but they've got formal rights to less than 20%. So there's a lot more work to do. And in some of the key forested regions like the Congo Basin, the Mekong, Southeast Asia and Indonesia, which is the home of key carbon stocks and biodiversity, the differences are even more stark. We estimate from RI side, based on costs associated with mapping, registration, some of that experience from around the world, that for communities to meaningfully contribute to the 2030 climate and biodiversity goals, it'll require the recognition of an additional 400 million hectares of tropical forests and the mobilization of at least $10 billion in support of that first target, in support of that recognition. And this is trying to be really conservative. This is a minimum estimate. There's some other estimates of the funding required, in the area of 30 billion by 2030. Kevin touched on the findings from Rainforest Foundation Norway. Okay, so we need to raise more money and channel it to local peoples, build capacity to implement. Of course, there's more work to do, like Kevin mentioned from the Rainforest Foundation Norway report. Over the past 10 years, the amount of funding for Indigenous peoples' tenure and forest management is about 1% of the amount of ODA for climate and adaptation and mitigation over the same period. So there's a lot more to be raised. So in that sense, the pledge is a good start, but more is required to address the scale of the problem. But aside from the availability of funding, we've started talking about this already, there are other bottlenecks associated with the systems for channeling funding to rights holders on the ground. This year, RRI partnered with RFN to build on the Falling Short report, and we developed and launched a report called Funding with Purpose, where we looked at historic donor transactions to support community forest and tenure, forest management and tenure over the last decade to assess how fit for purpose these systems were with respect to the ways of working, culture, and demands of local peoples and the administrative needs of the donor community. We looked at a data set. The data set's like 10,000 donor transactions for the last 10 years, and assessed via proxy whether or not activities were led by communities, rights holders, whether there was mutual accountability in the implementation of projects, whether funding was flexible and long-term or not, if it was gender inclusive, and if it was timely and accessible. There was some good and some not so good in the trends, as I'm sure as you can imagine. From the perspective of whether funding was led or developed in collaboration with communities, we found that only 17% of that big data set directly named an indigenous or community group in the project documents, indicating that there's a low share of the funding that's currently being used by organizations on the ground. In terms of accountability, it goes both ways, right? From donors to community, from community to donor. We found that it primarily sort of flowed one way from community to donor. For example, I'm not picking on anybody on this panel, but for example, many of the private foundations who've made commitments under this COP26 pledge don't share data on their projects systematically. In terms of flexibility and duration of projects, the work on the ground from the community perspective is flexible, it's fluid. Groups are challenged by incursions into forests. Maybe there are political windows of opportunity to advance the reform agenda or to strengthen their position, but without flexibility and funding, they can't capture that. We found that generally funding and funding arrangements were inflexible. At the same time, we did see indications that the duration of projects over the last 10 years had increased, which is a good thing. From the gender inclusivity perspective, only 27% of that data set on indigenous tenure and forest management included gender-related keywords, despite, as Melania was introducing, the essential role of women in forest management, and understanding that, in many cases, they're excluded from governance and decision-making processes. This was also conservative. We looked for keywords. The data is very difficult. We looked for keywords, and we didn't get into how these projects actually worked in practice, so that's probably an overestimate. In terms of being timely and accessible, also not picking on anyone on the panel, but for those of us who have had to navigate securing donor funding and then reporting, it's heavy. It's heavy for us who have the systems and the time to do it. It's even heavier for people on the ground, and that was backed up in the findings. Administration was heavy, and in many cases, those represented a barrier to entry for groups, local groups, to directly engage with funders and access funding. So, to answer the question, in order for the pledge to be a game changer, we hope that it's important progress. We hope it instigates even more commitments, right? Can leverage it to raise more funding. That funding begins to reach the point of impact, more direct relationships channeling to the local level, and that it helps instigate more balanced, as Kevin was mentioning, more balanced partnerships between funders, rights holders, and I think also intermediaries, that becomes the norm. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryson. And I'm just going to do one follow-up for Kevin, because another way in which, you touched on this a little bit, Bryson, sort of how this pledge can affect other pledges, but do the donors have some role in influencing all these other donors and pledges around the zero deforestation, around other climate? Is there an attempt to not only try to implement this one, which obviously is a big challenge on its own, but also to influence the way these other pledges are working?
I think that's a huge problem with the pledges. As you mentioned, it's certainly the case that good intentions of supporting indigenous peoples and local communities is not enough, and it would be possible for that funding to actually be harmful for indigenous peoples and local communities if programs and projects are not well designed in consultation with communities. But the absence of indigenous peoples and local communities from the rest of the pledges that were announced in Glasgow is really quite stark. And when I look at the 100 whatever countries with 90% of the world's forests that have said they're going to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030. I mean, how is the question? Because we have the experience of the last 10 years of this surge of private sector companies making commitments to get deforestation out of their commodity supply chains, most of which were basically press releases without clear implementation roadmaps, milestones, timelines, no real reporting and accountability mechanisms, etc. You saw some progress in the palm oil sector on deforestation, but basically very little progress elsewhere. And in terms of stopping land grabbing and violations of the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, what we hear from our partners is really no change on the ground. So I'm afraid that these government commitments risk replicating some of the things that we've learned, or replicating the deficiencies in some of these other commitments instead of incorporating aspects that we've learned are so important. Clear roadmaps with timelines and milestones for implementation, independent monitoring and verification, the release of data, and the incorporation of indigenous peoples and local communities at all stages of the design and implementation of the commitments. Because indigenous peoples and local communities are the ones on the ground that are actually managing a lot of those forests. And so basically, I would say we'll know the pledges and commitments overall that were announced in Glasgow are serious when we see a huge surge in support for indigenous peoples and local communities that goes well beyond the 1.7 billion that was pledged, because to actually halt and reverse deforestation by 2030 would require massive investment in the order of magnitude that Bryson mentioned, going to communities.
Thanks, Kevin. Melania, would you like to comment on the new pledges and the old ones too?
Bien, yo creo que cuando hablamos de financiamiento tenemos grandes preocupaciones, sobre todo la fragmentación del territorio.
When we talk about financing, we have lots of problems, especially because of the fragmentation of the land.
En los últimos tiempos se viene hablando de los bosques amazónicos, pero ¿qué hay de los bosques secos que están en la costa? ¿Qué hay de los bosques andinos o altoandinos? Decimos, también hay que ir pensando en forma integral de los glaciales, de los bofedales, de los ojos de agua, que alimenta, en el caso, por ejemplo, de nuestros países de Sudamérica, alimenta generalmente esos glaciales al oriente, o sea, a la Amazonía. ¿Qué pasaría si se seca el agua?
Okay, when we think about this problem, we don't have to think only about the forests of, for example, Amazon, because there are also forests that are getting drier and drier that are placed in other places, such as near the oceans. And we also have glaciers that are melting and forests that are having problems in the area of the Andes. So we, as indigenous women, are worried about this problem because there are organizations that are territorial organizations, and we want to organize ourselves also for fighting for our collective rights.
Asimismo, tenemos la preocupación de las disputas por financiamiento en la Amazonía, y esto pues debilita las organizaciones indígenas sobre todo.
We are also worried because of the disputes that are being creating.
A las mujeres indígenas nos preocupa cuando algunas organizaciones amazónicas dicen ser organizaciones territoriales, ¿no? Y con ese discurso quieren también seguir sometiéndonos a las mujeres indígenas, que también somos territoriales, pero nos organizamos como mujeres indígenas para luchar por nuestros derechos colectivos e individuales y también por las múltiples violencias que vivimos las mujeres indígenas, la violencia de género, por ejemplo. Por eso nuestra lucha es al interno también de nuestros propios pueblos indígenas y hacia afuera de las otras violencias que vivimos.
We are also worried because we are suffering violences as indigenous women. We are worried because there are organizations that declare themselves as Amazonian organizations and territorial organizations, but they are not. And we are willing to fight for our collective rights.
Las mujeres indígenas nos venimos organizando para proponer desde nuestro sentir y como transmisoras también de conocimiento, ciencia y tecnología ancestral, la protección de las vidas. Y ello es proteger el territorio, no pensando como guardianas, sino pensando en las futuras generaciones.
As indigenous women, we are organizing ourselves in order to propose our way, our knowledges, our cultures, our sciences and technologies, all these to protect lives and also to protect our territory, not only considering ourselves as guardians, but also thinking always about the next generations.
Y para ello no solo es proteger a las personas, sino también el agua, el océano, los bosques andinos, los bosques de la costa, como los bosques secos y en general las vidas, y aún las vidas que no se ven a simple vista.
And to do so, we don't have to protect only people, but also water, oceans, the forests of the Andes, and also the places on the coast. Also there we have dry forests, we have insects, we have medicinal plants, we have fishes. All these are lives, even if we maybe don't consider it strictly like that.
Porque nuestras vidas dependen de esas otras vidas. Por eso las mujeres indígenas, aún con nuestras vidas, defendemos el territorio integral. Y no solo una parte, sino, como decimos, la integralidad.
Because our lives depend on the lives of other species. That's why we as indigenous women are fighting to protect not only our lives, but also our territory in as an integral land.
Las mujeres indígenas no somos guardianas del territorio, sino somos parte de ella. Somos también naturaleza y por eso la defendemos.
We as indigenous women are not only the guardians of this territory, we are also part of it, and that's why we protect it and we defend it.
Hay algunas tensiones y desafíos hoy por la conservación de los bosques amazónicos. Tener en cuenta la corrupción que ha calado duro también a las organizaciones indígenas y esto ha traído individualismo, divisiones.
There are lots of tensions nowadays and also challenges because we are fighting for the protection of our forests in Amazon, but we also have to fight against corruption that is very present in lots of organizations, also indigenous organizations.
Asimismo, podemos decir que han surgido tutores que se sienten dueños de los pueblos indígenas y no hay un trato como sujeto de derechos, sino como propiedad, ¿no? Propiedad de los pueblos indígenas.
And in this sense, there are people that considers and act as if they are the tutors, if they are the owners of indigenous people, but they don't consider it as a subject of law, but as a property.
Asimismo, está vigente la discriminación hacia las mujeres indígenas, que algunos de nuestros hermanos indígenas, algunas de organizaciones mixtas indígenas, nos ven como competencia por los financiamientos, nos ignoran, nos niegan y ponen obstáculos para nuestro fortalecimiento como mujeres indígenas en vez de caminar juntos y juntas.
There is also the problem of discriminations against indigenous women. There are also indigenous people that are looking at us if we are their rivals, because it's like if everybody is trying to get the same financial resources. We have been ignored. And this is a problem for our strengthening as indigenous women.
Melania, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap it up, even though you're getting more and more interesting as you go. We only have a few minutes left for this part.
Bien, yo sé que la hora es, y más con la traducción, ¿no? Es un poco más difícil, pero bueno, vamos a entrar a los desafíos. Los desafíos es fortalecer movimientos indígenas en su diversidad o integralidad y no solo la Amazonía. Ese es un desafío. Otro desafío es un trabajo articulado también con los gobiernos locales, regionales y el gobierno nacional, que el gobierno nacional no permite, pues, ¿qué te digo? O no cumple sus compromisos climáticos que muchas veces decimos que se han dado.
So one of the challenges is to strengthen these movements for indigenous diversity, not only in Amazon, and also there is another challenge that is at local level, at regional level, to strengthen the movements of these women that are indigenous women.
Hay un desafío de fortalecer los movimientos de mujeres indígenas.
There is also a challenge to strengthen the movement of indigenous women.
Y asimismo, tiene que haber protocolos y mecanismos claros para evitar la corrupción en las organizaciones indígenas.
And we also have to have mechanisms and protocols to avoid corruption in the same indigenous organizations.
Y lograr realmente la adaptación y mitigación al cambio climático y la protección del territorio en conjunto o en su integralidad. Gracias.
And also adapt to the problem of climate change and actually protect our territory in its integrity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Melania. That was really enlightening. I'm going to move on to our last couple questions. First, I'm going to ask George about the link between these pledges and livelihoods. All of the pledges in different ways have the challenge of aligning with local needs, which most obviously means aligning with issues of livelihoods and well-being. I'm wondering how they can do better, and in particular, perhaps also the question of gender, not just aligning with the needs of the community, which tends to be the men in the community, but also to what extent they're addressing gender. So I'll go to George first, and then I'll have a question for Truly to end this session.
Sure, thank you. So yeah, I think it does present a huge opportunity for bringing that forest and livelihoods piece together. I think it's already been mentioned that it is somewhat of a step change in terms of funding and the numbers, and there needs to be recognition that that's in a positive direction, I think. And I think where those pledges and where that finance trickles down into programs that really support capacity building, builds that enabling environment around tenure and land and rights, I think it has the potential to underpin both livelihoods and forests if done well. And I think that's the crucial thing, though, is the challenges around that. But I think more broadly, if there are opportunities for those dual wins, if you protect forests, you do contribute to the longer-term livelihoods in a lot of cases. It helps protect the natural asset base that people do rely on. It can have significant benefits for watersheds, managing local temperature increases, improving soil health, which for smallholders all contributes to their production, their agriculture, and the longevity of that. I think, for carbon specifically, and the piece around carbon in this space, for smallholders, that does represent a specific opportunity as well. I think in agroforestry and carbon markets, you can see direct links where there's the potential for that to be a real uplift in diversifying income streams for farmers. But I think, we need to be careful to view that not as one of many activities and not a silver bullet, which I think the buzz around carbon markets has sometimes created a bit of a narrative around. And then coming back to the challenges, and some of that's already been touched on, a lot of that around operationalizing carbon markets in an equitable way is a huge challenge. Some of that's about pricing and ensuring that people know what it's worth. And clear land tenure and ownership of trees is crucial in that, and obviously easier for the agroforestry sector. But it's also about ensuring where carbon is being bought and that's being done in a meaningful, full, prior informed and consent way. So FPIC is kind of really mainstreamed in that, which is difficult. And, I'm preaching to the converted. We all know that that's very difficult to do. And some of that comes back to the power imbalances as well. So it's those unseen power structures that are harder to transform through programming and through finance. That's cultural shifts. And ensuring that communities have access to all that information as well is a real challenge. So I think, we're already hearing examples of land grabs and speculation around land prices with the carbon market, and some of that mirrors what's happened in commodity booms as well. So I think taking lessons that we've seen where there have been unequitable practices of smallholder farming and things like that is really useful to take forward into carbon markets going forward. But I'm sure that others on the panel can speak to some of the nuance and have a much more direct relationship with some of those challenges.
Thank you. And we will have time for audience questions, so there'll be time for other people to contribute to some of these. Truly, I'd just like if you could give us your thoughts on what do you see as the research areas that aren't happening now that should be priority for the future around these kinds of pledges?
Yeah, thank you, Anne. So looking at the last probably 2 decades, I think that there's like 3 broad emerging research domains that might have played and will play increasingly important roles in academic research on forest and livelihood. So first is research on responsibilization of forests as a global commons, and second, research on monitoring and evaluation of forest and agriculture sustainability programs, and the path towards more inclusive and holistic evaluation. And third, research on the broader global trade, consumption, and environment relations. So looking at the first domain of research and responsibilization of forest, so responsibilization refers to transfer of responsibility from higher authorities to communities or individuals to take active roles in the resolving problem. Now, in the new era of international commitments on forest protection, so we could illustrate the system as a flow of responsibilization from donors to national government, then to regional, subnational government, and finally to indigenous people, local communities, and field facilitators, agents. Now, every level of governance has different levels of ideas, agendas, concerns about the program, how the program should operate. So, for example, international donors might have their certain imaginaries, ideas of planetary commons, and how responsibility for forests and people. So while at the same time, the national government might have their own national level concerns regarding food and energy security, development, and sovereignty. And subnational level government will also have a certain challenge in regards to relationship with the central government. And the local communities and field workers as agents and subjects of the programs would likely also need to juggle to meet these different ideas, agendas, and regulation, while also same time facing challenges in terms of historical and current inequalities, land pressure, competing interests from various actors, and diverse ethnic and cultural norms. So the role of research in this area can be important in at least two ways. First, to unpack and the process of responsibilization from donor to indigenous people or local communities, and how the IPLCs or field agents respond, react, or adapt to this myriad of responsibilities, and how different communities would respond. And second, to explore the unintended consequences of responsibilizations, such as conflicts and elder capture. So understanding of how different communities would respond to forest and sustainable programs is important in order to improve design of monitoring evaluation method. The second research domain that could play an increasing role, I think, is monitoring evaluation. So monitoring evaluation have become an important instrument in measuring accountability of forest-related fundings and programs. So in the last decades, we have seen significant rise in the landscape and monitoring studies, especially those conducted over a broad scale, either global or national level. So a lot of these studies look mostly on the biophysical landscape dynamics, such as the change in extent of land use, land cover, climate, crops, and other variables that can be generated from satellite imageries or remote sensing. At the same time, we have also seen continuously flourishing local studies that focused on the social complexities, such as aspects of social equity, political economy, human rights, environmental justice. So at the overall landscape level, currently there seems to be a disciplinary disconnect, especially between assessment or evaluation conducted at the broad level on the biophysical process and those at the local level on the social processes. So there are certainly rooms to improve existing landscape monitoring evaluation to make it more holistic and inclusive. For example, first by including proxies of social context and histories in landscape-based evaluation. These proxies can be obtained either from field surveys, interviews, or secondary census data sets. And second, by considering more multi-dimensional outcomes in the evaluation of forest and agriculture sustainable programs, and also identifying the trade-offs and synergies between social and economic and environmental dimensions. And third, I think there's also rooms to explore the heterogeneity of impacts in different areas with differing biophysical and social characteristics, as well as model production, such as plantation versus smallholders. And also exploring the potential spillover effects of forests or sustainable programs to other areas, either positive or negative. So, okay, so when working on the broad-scale landscape-based evaluation, I think research also needs to be critical of the limitation of the evaluation framework in capturing on-the-ground complex realities and the political context. I think a researcher could help provide some caveats to guide donors and policymakers in terms of aspects that are not captured by the data. And the last thing would be emerging research domains on the global trade, consumptions, environmental relations. So unlike the two research domains where the focus is on the forest-rich countries, so this part looks at the broader factors that potentially drive environmental pressure in forest countries. So research probably can try to enhance the improvement of the quantification of social and environmental footprints embodied in trade of raw products, and also exploring strategies to reduce demand and consumption to help ease environmental pressure, and also to assess opportunities and challenges in the implementation of sustainability standards, as well as potential benefits and costs to indigenous people and local communities. So I'm sure there are other research topics of forest people that are highly relevant and timely that are not covered in my previous explanation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this. Is it on? Now it's on. Okay, great. thank you so much. This was really, really rich. I now think we still have about 15 minutes for Q&A from the audience. That means you each need to cut your final statement down to 1 minute max. But let's take some questions. I think we have people here in the audience. We also might have some questions by Zoom, so someone will have to help me with that part. And I can barely see out there with these bright lights, but okay, right here, and then behind you, number 1 and 2.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Really, really insightful and wonderful. My name is Carlos. I'm from Conservation International. I want to ask a question in the context of what Claire means, especially on the meaning of the last letter, which is engagement, in relation to what was mentioned from the panel, that a lot of the work that we do have helped inform the 1.7 billion pledge. And so my question is, how can we do a better job of engaging with the stakeholders that are in need of the kind of work that we do to better inform and continue this dialogue? And so how do we do that better? If you can say something about that, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Carlos. And I think we'll take 3 questions first. So, Sabahat, please.
So I have 2 questions, both relate to this international peoples as a part of solution.
Can you introduce yourself too?
Okay. And international, very recent international recognition and interest in indigenous people. Okay. My name is Sabahat Ramchovi-Suominen. I'm associate research professor at Luke, Finland. Okay, so my question first is that are we really interested in indigenous peoples and promoting and improving their rights and their well-being, or are we interested solely in their knowledge? And what I mean is that with all this interest, right, how do we ensure that indigenous peoples and their knowledge won't become the next big frontier for extraction? And I mean epistemic extraction and epistemic dispossession. Second question is, do you see a risk for polarization between indigenous people and other traditional local communities? And who decides who is indigenous? Because unlike in North and South Americas, across African and Asian countries, the lines are a bit more blurred. Thank you.
Thank you. One more question before we, do I see hands? Please, go ahead. Sorry.
For presentations. I'm Giorgio Ardachescu. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at University of Sheffield. And my question is a bit of a provocation. How do we make sure that this aid is not continuing business as usual? And why do we still why do we call it still aid and not sort of a compensation for the environmental harm that we are inflicting on these indigenous people and communities who are taking care of the environment? It's a bit of a provocation. It just seems to me that it's just another way of continuing our green growth while claiming that we are making them our partners in this process of setting targets for ourselves, not for them. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. So no one said who their questions were directed to, so I'm going to let you raise your hands. We have a question from Carlos about engagement, from Sabaheta about knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and about polarization between indigenous peoples and other local communities, defining who's indigenous, and from Sheffield University, I'm sorry, I didn't catch the name, on how to prevent, why are we calling this aid rather than compensation? Okay, George, please. Sorry, there's a... You can both answer the same ones if you want.
Sorry.
We'll do the best we can.
Pipped into the post. Yeah, I think it's a really valid point, and it's a really crucial point to ensure that there is that engagement at the local level. I think it's a criticism we hear a lot as governments, that there's not enough of it. And so, I think it's good to keep raising. Speaking from the FACT dialogue perspective and the work that we're doing in the Smallholder group, Some of that is really about our plans for next year are to build a kind of a learning journey series that really brings in non-government voices into the dialogue, to make sure that we have kind of voices, farmer voices that are brought into that government forum, and create that direct link. And also working with other stakeholders, NGOs, the private sector, the finance sector. But I think it really is crucial to have that farmer voice at the table. I know that under the IPLC work, they've done quite a bit of work with roundtables, and I think it's a really good example. And if the FACT work can follow suit on that with the smallholder perspective in mind, I think that's one key way that we are looking to try and bring in those voices, not just to the funding, but to the policy processes as well.
Thank you. And I think Bryson had wanted to follow.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to the first question and the, excuse me, the third. And just a reflection on the first question, how to do a better job of engaging with stakeholders. Last week, 2 weeks ago, I think last week, RRI hosted with the Forest Tenure Funders Group a webinar intended to provide a platform to share for the Forest Tenure Funders Group to share information with rights holders on the contents and purpose of the pledge. From RRI side, we provided the space and then supported a lot of the outreach to the networks and the regions and countries. And what we found was people on the ground didn't know that there was a pledge. And key leaders, right? And in practice, the groups who would represent the destination of the funding being committed at the global level, the pledge, and hopefully more, weren't aware that there was a pledge. So it was clear we suspected this, but it was clear that there's a big gap in those network connections. And I think one of the ways to ensure more engagement is providing spaces for Indigenous peoples and local communities to step into, and make that sort of information sharing possible and happen. So that's just a reflection, and I agree with you. On the third question on ensuring aid's not, is this aid? How do we make sure this isn't business as usual? Are we financing the growth agenda? But right, I'm with you. One thing we didn't talk about and we didn't get to is the sort of the emergence of new mechanisms to channel funding from the global context to the local, right? And these are rights holder-led mechanisms, led and steered by leaders on the ground. There's some examples from there's the Mesoamerican Territorial Fund. There's a fund being contemplated by Oman and Walahi in Indonesia. There's a handful of others, and from RRI side, there's the Community Land Rights and Conservation Finance Initiative, led by a rights holder, led by a rights holder steering committee. We've been working on this over the last year and a half. We launched it in January, and we're moving towards pilots in the Amazon Basin, Congo, East Africa, and Indonesia by the end of the year. So one of the things that we've learned in advancing Clarify, this new rights holder-led mechanism to re-grant funds to the local level, is what's key is the planning and the identification of the pipeline, right? It's, the business as usual is inviting proposals. The approach we've used is sort of the grassroots networking approach. I don't know a good word for this, a networking approach. We'd secured some limited budget. We came to the regions with budget and some targets on hectares protected, forests conserved, and networks and countries came together to say, okay, these are the key landscapes. These are the key forests. These are the key activities. Maybe it's community forest management. Maybe it's support for capacity building at the local level. All sorts of different things. So, the pilots that emerged were far and above the budget that we had. And far and above the targets that we set for this first iteration in terms of area, and aligned with the local context and the demands of folks on the ground. So I think in order to get away from the sort of business as usual, the implementation has to be done in partnership, and identification of opportunities has to really be done in partnership with people on the ground. So that's a reflection on the third question. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryson. do we have anyone else who wants to jump in? And if not, I'm going to call on Melania. I'd like to hear your answer to the question in particular about the risk of polarization.
Sí, mira, yo creo que de alguna manera se relacionan las tres preguntas. Una de las cosas que nosotras pensamos, uno, es fortalecer la autonomía, si hablamos de pueblos indígenas, y la libre determinación.
I actually think that the three questions are related, one to each other. The first thing that we have to do is to strengthen the relationship when we speak about indigenous people.
Fortalecer esa soberanía alimentaria.
To strengthen also this,
fortalecer la soberanía energética. Es revalorar, recuperar los conocimientos, ciencia y tecnología ancestral para la adaptación y mitigación al cambio climático. Por cierto, el clima ha ido cambiando siempre, no es novedad. Lo que pasa es la aceleración, ¿no? La aceleración del calentamiento global.
So if we strengthen the sovereignty for food, energy sovereignty, this is a way also to recognize the knowledges of our ancestors. And it is also a way to mitigate climate change. We have to say that climate change is not something new. There has always been climate change. The thing that is new is the acceleration of climate change and global warming.
Pensar y trabajar en el territorio integral y fortalecer el territorio colectivo, mantener y proteger el territorio colectivo, porque en nuestros países todavía existe el territorio colectivo administrado y gestionado por los pueblos indígenas. Y todo ello pensando siempre en el buen vivir o la vida digna de todos y todas. Gracias.
We have to think and work for an integral land and territory and protect a collective land, because in our place we still have collective territory that are managed by indigenous populations, and always thinking about a good way of living, buen vivir, and a life that is dignitous and for everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And unfortunately, we don't have time for more questions from the audience, but we do have a coffee break in 5 minutes, and you can approach the panelists and chat over the coffee break. Now I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give a 1-minute pitch on what's the most important thing to take forward. What are next steps? What are the priorities going forward? And I'll just start from this end, if that's okay. George?
Yeah, sure. So I have two, but I will be 30 seconds each. So one, I think, is around momentum. I think we have the pledges. We're moving out of the UK presidency, but the pledges should be something to coalesce around and maintain momentum around. And so kind of governments, but also the external community, we look to you to keep that momentum going alongside that. And then the second thing linked is very much partnerships. So we need to continue building partnerships in the FAC dialogue. Specifically, that's around producer-consumer countries and having that open dialogue. But also, you know, broader than that, broader than governments, it is about having partnerships that reach right down to the local level, and that's not just one direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Bryson? 1 minute.
Don't worry. I think the question's now around implementation. Well, raising more commitments, but also around implementation. So advancing those systems that are fit for purpose for getting right? Resources to the ground, which is going to mean capacity building at the local level, but also work within the donor and intermediary community to figure out, okay, like what can change, what are some of these shifts, and how are we going to go about it. I think that's the immediate task. I think that's the task for 2023 and 2024. And I agree with Georgina. More equitable partnerships. That's going to take some doing as well. Thank you.
Thank you, truly.
Yeah, so I think the most pressing issue, in my opinion, would be the allocation of funding for climate-based programs. So in the past, I think climate financing has been quite heavily allocated to mitigation programs. However, in recent decades, we have seen how weather have become more erratic with increasing frequency, intensity of extreme weather events, and these has had some worrying consequences on local communities, especially in developing countries. And these would most likely necessitate higher allocation adaptation programs than before. And given that climate and environmental pressure varies by countries, and the capacity of countries to adapt also against climate into disaster would also vary, I think designing the allocation of funding that is fair and equitable would be crucial. Thank you.
Thank you. Kevin.
Okay, two things. So one, Ford Foundation and some of the other donors who are part of the pledge have been supporting a group called the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities, which is a network of 5 indigenous and local community organizations from Latin America, Asia, and the Amazon. And they've developed quite a few really interesting ideas for indigenous and locally controlled funds, which would be a new way of channeling money directly to indigenous peoples and local communities and giving them more autonomy and control over how those funds are used. And you can go to the website foresttenure.org if you want to see the proposals that they've put together for those funds, which are interesting. And they're looking for researchers who can help them make the case at a more granular level, the contribution of individual indigenous territories to climate mitigation, biodiversity protection, etc. Second thing, believe it or not, donors actually do sometimes read peer-reviewed academic research, but only when people share it with us. You know, I don't follow journals. We don't have any subscriptions to any journals. So we love to hear about what's going on, what people are finding, what they're doing. But I would love to discuss ways to better plug in that information into the donor networks and how to support communications efforts of getting your findings out there into the world. And we do have some interesting examples working with some FLAIR members to do that.
Great, thank you. Melania.
Bien, en un minuto, ¿qué diré, Ann? Yo creo que lo más importante es dejar de ser antropocéntricos, porque nosotras también, las personas, somos naturaleza y sentir igual que los otros seres vivos. Y protejamos las vidas no solo de las personas, sino las vidas en general, de aquellos que aún no se ven, aquellos que son un insecto, que muchas veces lo vemos como nada, pero esa vida nos da vida a las personas. Por lo tanto, pensemos en nuestra casa grande, cuidemos y protejamos la casa grande, ¿no? Si queremos una vida digna. Solo puedo decir eso. Gracias.
I think that it's very important that we stop being anthropocentric, because we are part of the nature, we are also nature. We have to protect all lives, but also not only the lives of people, but also lives of things that we actually sometimes even don't see, for example, insects, that we think is nothing, but still it is a life. It is a life that, that gives us life. So I just think that we have to protect our house if we want to have a decent life. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This has been an incredible session. Great summary there with the key messages moving forward. I just want to add a couple things that I heard through the talk and I think reflect what you just said, drawing a lot on what Melania said earlier. So the topic of this session is implementation. So how do we do it? How do we do it well? Partner, more equitable partnerships, partner with Indigenous peoples and local communities on the ground. Recognize diversity on the ground, Indigenous and otherwise. Articulate from, in the responsibilization processes that Truly mentioned, articulation from the pledge and the idea to the ground. Strengthen local movements, women's movements, and other social movements on the ground. Fight corruption at all levels, everywhere in all of this, but including within the Indigenous organizations and federations. And be holistic. Think about territory and all that it means about life and our role as humans on this planet as one of many actors. Thank you. I'm going to close there. Thanks very much. Round of applause.